Hello, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Jenny Lukomsky, and I'm the archivist for the Congregation of Sisters of St. Agnes. I'd like to thank the Fond du Lac Public Library for giving me this platform to talk about the early history of the Sisters of St. Agnes as we celebrate the 150th anniversary of their move from Barton, Wisconsin to Fond du Lac. Most of the information from this talk comes from the book Ordinary Sisters, The Story of the Sisters of St. Agnes by Sister Margaret Lorimer. If you're interested in more details about the sisters, I encourage you to check this book out from the library. Before I start talking about the Sisters of St. Agnes, you might be wondering just who St. Agnes was. She was in her early teens in the 4th century during the last great persecution of Christians. She came from a wealthy family and was reportedly very beautiful. So she had several noblemen pursuing her, but she refused all their offers of marriage because she was devoted to Christ. So the nobles turned her in to the Roman authorities, and she was beheaded at the age of 13 in 304. She told her executioner to strike without fear, and it's said that her last words were, "To Christ alone I am associated in heaven, whom on earth I have loved with all devotedness." She's venerated today for her courage, spirit, and purity. So let's fast forward about 1,500 years to talk about the first of CSA's 3 founders. Father Caspar Rerl was born in 1809 in a little town on the outskirts of Salzburg, Austria. He entered the seminary at the age of 14 and was ordained when he was 26 in 1835. In the first half of the 19th century, there was a lot of upheaval in Europe. So people who were seeking greater economic opportunities, political freedom, or to escape military conscription emigrated to the United States. In religious circles, this caused a lot of excitement. And Father Rerl was caught up in this enthusiasm because he wanted to be an overseas missionary. So he petitioned to serve in New York in 1843, and it took about a year for the petition process to go through the channels. And during that time, he changed his mind. He decided he wanted to go to Wisconsin, which was a newly opened territory. And so in 1844, he arrived in New Orleans, and he spent about a year there working for the local diocese. Then in 1845, he came up to Milwaukee and was welcomed by Bishop John Martin Henney. Henney offered him a parish in Milwaukee, but working in an established parish wasn't really Father Rerl's idea of missionary work. Bishop Henney offered him this territory north of Milwaukee. He told him to go up to Calumet Township for a few days and get the lay of the land, meet the people. And so Father Rerl went up there, and he spent 3 days, and he knew he had found his home. He came back, talked to Bishop Henney about it, and Henney gave him the territory from Milwaukee to Green Bay, and then from the eastern shore of Lake Winnebago to Lake Michigan. So Father Rerl settled in Johnsburg, which already had a church, and then he set out on his first mission to West Bend and then Fond du Lac. In his knapsack, he carried his crucifix, chalice, books, and a few necessities. In the summertime, he often walked in bare feet in order to save shoe leather. He slept wherever he was offered shelter, and the only salary he received was the food that people gave him. One story reflects his charitable nature. He noticed a man with boots that were worn thin and had holes, so Father Rerl took his boots off, gave them to the man. The man said, "But I'm not Catholic," and Father Rerl said, "I didn't ask." So he felt his mission was not only to serve the Catholic population, but to serve the people of his territory. So Catholics in the region, however, were thrilled to have him, since many of them hadn't been able to receive sacraments in several years. He would generally visit a community every 6 months, although some locations he was able to visit more frequently. By 1847, he was joined by another priest and 3 lay brothers, so he was able to take longer and more frequent mission trips. Bishop Henney had authorized him to raise churches wherever he felt that there were enough Catholics in the community to support a parish. So when he would visit, he would plant a cross in the ground, usually on a hill, and tell the community members, "This is where you're going to build a church, and I better find a lot of progress when I come through here again." It wasn't long before Father Rarel could start focusing on a particular passion of his, education. There's this German idea that if you build a school, the church will follow. That's certainly what happened here in Fond du Lac with St. Mary's, where the school was built 8 years before the church was founded. So Rarel knew that the best way to maintain the faith of the immigrant population was to educate its youth. The schools would be open to children of all faiths because Father Rarel's primary concern was educating all the immigrant children. As the number of settlers in the territory nearly doubled to 305,000 between 1846 and 1850, there was a dire need for teachers. Father Rarel believed that a, quote, society of ladies could take on that role, as well as care for all the missions that he was establishing. And at this point, there were about a dozen missions that he was in charge of. The School Sisters of Notre Dame and the Dominicans had recently established mother houses in Wisconsin, but they didn't have enough sisters to send any Father Rarel's way. So then he wrote to convents in Europe asking for sisters, and that didn't work either. In 1852, he got a break from his missionary work and returned to Austria for a few years. So he spent some time writing and publishing a 2-volume prayer book called The Catholic Christian. But he devoted much of his time to finding sisters to teach in all the schools that he was envisioning for his territory. For 3 years, he visited convents throughout Europe, trying to persuade Mothers Superior to send their sisters to a land that was really still considered part of the American Western frontier. Remember, Wisconsin had only been a state for 4 years. In addition to the physical hardships that the pioneer sisters would encounter, teaching wasn't really considered an acceptable endeavor for religious sisters at that time. So Rarel's offer really wasn't appealing to the sisters in Europe. In 1855, he received permission to visit Rome. And while he was there, he visited the Basilica of St. Agnes. As he was praying, he had a vision of St. Agnes leading a group of women who were dressed in black and white. So he got an audience with Pope Pius IX and told him about this vision. The Pope gave Father Rarel his blessing, but let him know that he had to submit an acceptable rule within 10 years. So a religious rule, sometimes called constitutions, lays out the directives and customs for a religious community, including things like how they will govern themselves, what they're going to pray, how they're going to pray, when they're going to pray. Father Rarel excitedly returned to Wisconsin in the fall of 1855, all gung-ho about recruiting these sisters for his sisterhood. The Germans continued to arrive in large numbers. They settled in Milwaukee and in the surrounding communities. And the town of Barton was on the northern edge of Milwaukee, and he felt that it was going to be the gateway for the city because it was on the Milwaukee River. And so he moved his base of operations there in 1857. Barton didn't turn out like he thought. It ended up being much of a boom town. But in any case, he settled there, and from Barton he was able to minister to about 30 missions. So he was still having no luck in attracting women to his new congregation. He would write to priests asking them all the time to send women. And in one letter he wrote, quote, "I heard that the Right Reverend Bishop, being with you, said that your young people look very intelligent. Would it not be a shame by such an intelligent people not to find a couple of pious virgins who would consecrate themselves to God to serve him, guiding children to him? No excuse, Father, you ought to send 2. So he was nothing if not persistent. Finally, in June 1858, he found his first candidate, Gertrude Rehberg, or rather, she found him. She had wanted to join an order in Europe, but she didn't have a dowry. She came to America to be with her brother in Hartford, looking for a congregation to join. Father Joseph Rendell of St. Lawrence Church in Washington County sent her to Father Rarel. Their meeting went so well that Gertrude said she would try to find some more women who would join with her. So Father Rarel sent her to a Notre Dame convent to make a retreat and to learn about religious life. On August 10th, she returned to St. Lawrence Parish to celebrate the feast day of St. Lawrence. And she met Bishop Henny there, and he gave her permission to join Father Rarrell. 2 more women joined with Gertrude, and on August 12th, 1858, she, Magdalene Haffer, and Catherine Getz became the first Sisters of St. Agnes. As a sign of devotion to St. Agnes and Mary, the Mother of God, each sister was given the name Mary Agnes and the name of a saint. So Gertrude became Sister Mary Agnes Clara, Magdalene, Sister Mary Agnes Gertrudis, and Catherine, Sister Mary Agnes Mactildis. They used this format until 1870 when they dropped Agnes, and most simply used the initial M instead of Mary in front of their name, and that lasted until 1969. So these 3 sisters vowed for 1 year poverty, chastity, and obedience. They also promised to instruct and educate the youth entrusted to them and to do manual labor. Initially, they lived with neighbors in Barton while Father Rarrell negotiated the purchase of some land. And that land comprised 40 acres of woodland and 20 acres of farmland. The sisters wore a simple black dress with a white collar and bonnet. Father Rarrell was adamant that the sisters look like the people they would be serving. So he had no intention that they would become like a traditional sisterhood one might see in Europe. Remember that the Pope had told Father Rarrell he had to produce an acceptable rule within 10 years in order to be recognized by Rome. His first attempt in 1858 stated that the sisters were to be primarily teachers and servants of the priests in the missions. It read more like a list of chores than directives for living religious life. They should raise and manufacture flax, spin their own wool, make their own dresses, make candles and church vestments, clean the church, wash the vestments and linen, and they would also cook for the priest if he didn't already have a cook. So according to Father Rarrell, they would belong to the altar and service of the priests. So Bishop Henny was like, no. So Father Rarrell went back to the drawing board on that. But in the meantime, he forged ahead with his mission work. When he would return from his mission trips, he would gather the sisters in the chapel and teach them the Bible and Christian doctrine. And it was likely that very few of them had very much education prior to coming to the convent, so he would also teach them basic academic subjects and music. So since German was the native language of many of the sisters, they also learned English and Latin. Father Rarrell proclaimed that, quote, Agnes sisters shall neither sing nor pray what they do not understand, end quote. So those that didn't know Latin would sing and pray in their native tongue. It was a very difficult life. They lived in extreme poverty in a fieldstone house with no stove. They slept on blankets that were laid over straw ticks. They chopped their own wood and carried water from a spring that was 2 blocks away. The farmland Father Rarrell had purchased was their only source of food, but they didn't have any farm implements to cultivate the land. They often went hungry. So one story tells of several new candidates who arrived from Appleton around sundown one night. And they were greeted and given a meal of dried applesauce, bread, butter, fried pork, and a little bit of tea. So they thought that maybe the sisters had been doing housework all day and they didn't have time to prepare a proper meal. But after a few days, that they realized that this had actually been a feast for the sisters. But there was also a positive aspect to all this hardship. It meant the sisters had to rely on their own wits and skills to get by. They had to invent all of their own customs and way of life. Determination, creativity, and a can-do attitude became the hallmarks of the sisters as the years went on. With these rough conditions, it was hard to keep sisters. A lot of them left the community. In 1860, there were 18 sisters, but a year later, there was only 1, and she was blind. And I always feel a little bad when we talk about this sister, because we always say something like, and they were down to 1 blind sister. And well, she had a name, and that was Sister Ursula Hofen. And I always wonder what would have happened if she had left the community. I think she deserves a lot of credit for sticking around. If she had left, maybe Father Rarrell would have finally thrown in the towel. But luckily, that didn't happen. Within a month or so, Sister Clara, the first sister of St. Agnes, had come back to the community. She had left to join the Franciscans, but she spent a month down there and decided to come back. She felt more at home with Father Rero. And soon after, we start seeing more and more sisters join the congregation. So with numbers slowly increasing, Father Rero opened a school at Barton for, quote, any child, Indian or white, healthy, blind, or crippled, end quote. The school attracted up to 60 pupils from the area. This spoke to Father Rero's deep conviction to provide education to all children, wherever it was needed. In 1862, Father Rero took another crack at a rule, and this one was more structured and less detailed, but it was never submitted to Rome. It prescribed a full habit for the sisters, including a face veil that sisters should wear when they speak to men, and it put strict limits in place in situations where a sister could talk to a layperson. As Father Rero wanted the sisters to be able to teach in the public schools, the rule also recommended that they take state exams and use government-approved textbooks. If a sister taught in a public school, another sister should teach at the Catholic school in the town or village. This is the environment that CSA's second founder, Anne Marie Hazett, steps into in 1863. Known as Mary, she was born in Buffalo, New York on May 7, 1847, to French immigrants. Her family moved to Detroit, where Mary was educated by the School Sisters of Notre Dame and the Society of the Sacred Heart. By the time she was 15, though, both her parents, 2 sisters, and a brother had died. It was the death of her brother in 1862 that was the catalyst for Mary coming to the congregation. The Hazetts lived next to the Dulso family in Detroit, and Mrs. Dulso wrote of the news of the Hazett boy's death to her daughter. Now, her daughter just happened to be Sister Tekla, a sister of St. Agnes. Tekla remembered Mary Agnes as bright, independent, outgoing, and particularly pious for a young girl. And she prayed that Mary might have a vocation to religious life. So she wrote her mother, asking her to broach the subject with Mary. This idea was very appealing to Mary. So despite the protestations of her brothers and the tears of her sister, she packed a bag and gratefully accepted a train ticket from Mrs. Dulso. When she arrived in Barton, Sister Tekla took her straight to Father Rero. He placed his hands on her head and told her that she would be called Agnes. So let's think about this for a minute. He would bestow upon her the name of the patron saint of the congregation, the saint to whom he had prayed for guidance in establishing a sisterhood, the saint he had envisioned leading other women. You know how there are certain people that when you first meet them, you know there's something special about them? Well, whatever that it factor is, Mary had it, and Father Rero recognized it immediately. So she set about learning German and was soon sent to Fond du Lac to work with the school superintendent to get her teaching license. Father Rero also purchased an organ so she could continue the music lessons she had started when she was a girl. On July 2nd, 1863, she made her first vows and became known as Sister Mary Agnes. A year later, at the age of 17, Father Rero named her superior of the congregation in charge of the school at Barton. And he also placed Sister Genevieve Pop in charge of the farm. So now there was some leadership at Barton that helped stabilize the daily lives of the sisters when Father Rero was away, although he still controlled the administration of the community as well as their spiritual care and education. While doing this, he was still walking all over the countryside to his 32 mission churches, and that didn't leave much time for him to provide the education and religious formation that the sisters really needed, and this would become problematic, as we'll soon see. That year, Bishop Henney instructed Father Rero to let the sisters decide who their superior should be. So on July 2nd, 1864, the same day Sister Agnes renewed her vows, she was elected superior of the congregation, earning 4 of the 5 votes. In 1865, Father Rero assigned her to open the public school in Marytown, while Sister Gertrude Laughlin taught at the town's Catholic school. So they became really good friends, and it was here that they also became acquainted with the Capuchins, who provided a pastor for Visitation Church. St. Agnes was superior of the congregation, principal and teacher at the district school, church organist, and then on weekends she walked 5 miles to St. Anna to give music lessons. So she understood how difficult daily life was for the sisters. Many left the community due to the physical deprivations, the demands of their ministry, and the uncertainty about the future of the congregation. So in addition to all her other duties, Sister Agnes had to figure out a way to retain sisters. In 1869, she was re-elected for a second term. She continued to be concerned about the deficiencies in the sisters' lives, such as the lack of regular meals, inadequate education and religious formation, unsuitable mission appointments, and the lack of an accepted rule. In November, she decided to return to the Mother House in Barton to take on the administrative tasks that she felt Father Rarrell had been neglecting or mismanaging. While she wanted to institute a regular religious life and establish a novitiate, Father Rarrell didn't believe the sisters needed to know much about spiritual life. His concern was only that they could teach, and that was questionable. One sister recalled that he didn't get sisters in the front door before he sent them out the back door to go teach. If they were at least 14 years old and knew a little English, he thought that they were good to go. He kept taking on more missions, but there weren't enough sisters to go around. Sister Agnes finally put her foot down when Father Rarrell wanted to send an unprepared candidate to teach in Appleton. And he also wanted to change some other sisters' assignments, and Mother Agnes didn't agree with that. Father Rarrell relented and said Sister Agnes could do whatever she felt was right, but to remember that he had commitments to fulfill. And that tension between the two continued on and off throughout that winter. So it's the spring of 1870 when the third founder of CSA enters the picture. Father Francis Haas, born Gregory Haas in Switzerland, was a diocesan priest, and he came to the United States with Father John Fry in 1856 to establish the Capuchin Franciscan Order at Mount Calvary, Wisconsin. They both became Capuchins while in the United States, taking the names Father Francis and Father Bonaventure. Father Haas was deeply spiritual, and he had a special devotion to the Sacred Heart. He believed that the trials people experience help them grow and become stronger. He's also said to have had a dry sense of humor and a broad understanding of human nature. The Capuchins were conducting a Lenten mission at St. Bridget's Parish in Wayne, Wisconsin, and the Sisters of St. Agnes were invited to cook for the event. Sister Agnes looked forward to this opportunity to pick the brain of Father Haas, and also to maybe get a little counsel regarding the conflicts that she was having with Father Rarrell. So Father Haas had heard about her in the community, and he really didn't hold out much hope for them. But once he met Sister Agnes and the other sisters, he changed his mind. Like everyone else, he was impressed with her energetic zeal, and he appreciated how the sisters were so dedicated in their work. Agnes and Father Haas met twice during the mission, and by the end of it, he had encouraged her to move to Fond du Lac. Fond du Lac, he told her, had cheap land and schools where the sisters could teach. It was the second largest city in the state and supported a railroad hub. It was also located only 12 miles from the Capuchin monastery, so Sister Agnes felt she could always go there to receive the spiritual direction and advice for the community. Barton, on the other hand, was down to 15 residents and was less than ideal for the location of the Mother House. So Sister Agnes headed up to Fond du Lac to talk with Father Nicholas Pickle, the pastor of St. Mary's Parish. They hit it off, talking for 4 hours, and Sister Agnes even played the organ for a while. He told her the sisters would be welcomed by the city's 2 other pastors to teach 600 Catholic children in town. And he also knew of a property that could be purchased for between $5,000 and $6,000 that encompassed 5 or 6 city lots and had a large frame house on it she could use as her mother house. So Sister Agnes was all in after this meeting. She returned to Barton to talk it over with Father Rarrell, and then headed down to Milwaukee to discuss it with the general vicar of the diocese, Father Martin Kundig. Agreeing with Sister Agnes about the greater opportunity in Fond du Lac, Kundig told her to go ahead and transfer the mother house there. Showing a great business sense, instead of the 5 or 6 lots suggested by Father Pickle, Sister Agnes purchased 12 lots from E. Phillips on June 8, 1870 for $6,300. The property was bordered by Division and Sheboygan streets and included the 2-story frame house, a new barn, and a new stable. At the end of June, Father Rarrell met with Father Kundig, and while we don't know what was said, the end result, as relayed in a letter from Kundig to Sister Agnes, said that Father Kundig would take over directorship of the congregation, while Father Rarrell would remain as the chaplain and confessor. He then laid out some directives to the sisters, saying that they would no longer have to do the heavy lifting on the farm, that they would have adequate housing and nutritious meals. Agnes must have felt an immense sense of relief, but Father Rarrell must have felt like he was being slowly squeezed out, first by Mother Agnes and Father Haas, and now by Father Kundig. It had to be a great disappointment for him. Father Rarrell had so many gifts, but running a religious community was not one of them. He was the ideal missionary priest, a gifted scholar, a fabulous teacher, an inspirational pastor. But living as a diocesan priest was a much different existence than living in a religious community. And he just didn't understand the difference. He was so focused on his mission churches and schools that he had a hard time providing for the sisters' physical, educational, and spiritual needs. So while all this was going on, the sisters were planning a summer retreat for the end of July. Father Rarrell had asked Father Haas to give the retreat, and Mother Agnes, seeing an opportunity here, asked Father Haas if he would spend some time writing constitutions for the sisters. So Haas agreed, and he set to work. On the last day of the retreat, Father Kundig came up from Milwaukee. He had been invited by Father Rarrell, and he pulled Sister Agnes aside and told her he was going to disband the Congregation of Sisters of St. Agnes. So I'm sure she was shocked. I mean, this is the same guy who just a couple months earlier approved the transfer of the Mother House to Fond du Lac. So she told him, "Look, Father Haas has been working on constitutions for us this week. Why don't you go talk to him?" So he did. He had a private conversation with Father Haas, and then Father Kundig and Father Rarrell read the constitutions that night. The next morning, they had a meeting with all the sisters. Father Kundig read the constitutions and asked the sisters if they approved. All the sisters rose in unison and accepted the constitutions as they were written. So afterwards, Father Haas celebrated Mass with the sisters, and he gave a very emotional sermon on sacrifice and devotion. Father Kundig then presided over the investiture of 11 candidates and the profession of 3 novices under the new rule. So the sisters finally had that novitiate program that Mother Agnes had wanted. After dinner, there was one more task to complete: the canonical election of a new superior. Sister Agnes was elected unanimously, and Father Kundig proclaimed that she would now be known as Mother Agnes. So was it coincidence that Mother Agnes asked Father Haas to work on the constitutions that particular week? Or maybe there was a little bit of divine intervention going on. Who can say? But in 1881, Mother Agnes summed up the early history of the congregation like this, quote, "Our community sprung up among thorns and many dark clouds of adversity passed over its head during the short period of our existence," end quote. So probably the understatement of the year. So that week, there was a flurry of activity as the sisters prepared to move to Fond du Lac. Father Rarrell approached Mother Agnes in private and told her he wasn't coming with them. So she must have been stunned again. He said that he was staying behind because he had to take care of his missions, and Barton was the best place to do that from. So when he told the sisters the next day that he would be staying, 6 of them decided to stay with him. And that included Sister Gertrude, who had been Mother Agnes's best friend and confidant from their days in Marytown. So it had to have been a very difficult situation for all the sisters to navigate, and even the convent dog, Barney, didn't know what to do. But eventually, he hopped into one of the wagons that was holding the sisters' possessions, and he set off with Mother Agnes and the 26 other sisters to Fond du Lac on August 1st, 1870. For a time, there were 2 congregations of St. Agnes then, the Barton Convent and the Fond du Lac Convent. The Barton Convent slowly began to fail throughout the 1870s. Sister Gertrude tried to move the Mother House to Janesville, but she didn't have the parish support there that she needed. So Father Rarrell sought some advice from a friend at St. Francis Seminary in Milwaukee, and he told her to give it up. And he just couldn't do that. He even went so far as to say that he would never accept advice from that guy again. So on March 18th, 1879, on the eve of the Feast of St. Joseph, Mother Agnes saw a bobsleigh pull into the convent grounds. It looked like the driver who came to the door was well off, but his passenger was poor. And the driver turned out to be an old friend from Barton, and he just stopped by to say hello. The sister who answered the door invited him and his friend inside for some hospitality and a hot meal, but he refused. And Mother Agnes was watching all this from a window when she realized that the passenger was Father Rarrell. So they invited him in, and it took a little encouragement, but he came, and he spent the night there with the sisters. So you can imagine, this is like a scene from a Hallmark movie. Everybody was so thrilled that Father Rarrell was back to celebrate with them. So he accepted an invitation to stay overnight and say the next day's Mass with the sisters. On Mother Agnes's instructions, the sisters spent the night making a new cassock, beretta, and shirts for Father Rarrell, as well as producing a new coat, hat, and boots. So it was such a joyful reunion for Mother Agnes, Father Rarrell, and all the sisters. As happy as that day was, Father Rarrell noticed the disparities between his convent and the Fond du Lac convent, and he finally realized it was time to pull the plug. So the Barton Sisterhood was dissolved on September 1st, 1879. The sisters were told they could join another congregation or leave religious life altogether at the end of their annual vows. So ultimately, 7 sisters joined the Fond du Lac convent. Recognizing Father Rarrell's frailty, Mother Agnes sent him a teacher and 3 other sisters to help with his property in Barton. He died there on September 3rd, 1881. And his last words were, "O dear Saint Agnes," so devoted to the end. In 1968, CSA had his remains exhumed and moved to St. Joseph Springs Cemetery. So he lies there now near Mother Agnes and the other pioneer sisters of the congregation. Now, every year on September 3rd, the sisters celebrate Founders Day, honoring Father Rarrell, Mother Agnes, and Father Haas. Despite the tension that existed between Father Haas and Mother Agnes, she never lost the respect and admiration she had for him. Even after the move to Fond du Lac, she would ask the sisters to pray for him. But she had a vision for the future of CSA, and as hard as it was to leave Father Rarrell and those 6 sisters behind in Barton, she knew that the congregation had to move forward if they had any chance to grow and thrive. So in 1870, at the age of 23, Mother Agnes was responsible for the formation, welfare, ministries, spiritual health, and financial stability of the sisters. Do you remember what you were doing when you were 23? So there was so much to take care of when the sisters first got to Fond du Lac. CSA staffed 8 missions in 1870, including their first out-of-state in Defiance, Ohio. The meager pay, if any, that sisters received from these missions was not enough to sustain them. At St. Peter's Parish, for example, a parishioner would drive a sister around the countryside in a wagon, and residents would offer produce or other articles to the sister in lieu of payment. The sisters also raised money by making quilts, lace, artificial flowers, wreaths, and embellishments for First Communion veils. They held fairs and bazaars where these items were sold. They received pay for playing the organ at Mass and for providing music lessons. And sisters were also sent out on collecting tours. They went to New York, Michigan, Georgia, Ohio, Indiana, even Canada and Cuba. Upon their arrival in Fond du Lac, Mother Agnes asked Sister Antonia Schmitz to design a new habit. She wanted a uniform look and something that would bring pride to the sisters. CSA used the same habit with a few modifications for nearly 100 years. The habit included a pleated black dress with a small white collar, a cape, and a black veil. Mother Agnes had already won over Father Pickle in Fond du Lac, but now she had to earn the confidence of all the other pastors and the city leaders. It's no doubt they were aware of her estrangement from Father Rarrell, who had at one time been pastor of St. Joseph's Parish. And it didn't help that she was living at a time when many people were hostile to women in leadership. Just 1 month after arriving in Fond du Lac, the sisters opened St. Agnes School to all children in the area. Mother Agnes rented a home nearby to board some of the students, while classes for them and day students were held in the barn. Some of the best families in Fond du Lac sent their children to the school, and those students who could pay helped support those who couldn't. So we see Father Rarrell's legacy in action here. The belief that all children, no matter their religion or ability to pay, deserve a quality education. Mother Agnes also took in orphans and children whose families couldn't support them. Her goal was to find suitable homes for these kids, and in most cases she was able to do that. The sisters continued with slow but steady growth, both in their own numbers and in the number of missions they took on, including St. Mary's School here in Fond du Lac in 1872. Ultimately, the Sisters of St. Agnes would teach in 7 Fond du Lac area schools: St. Mary's, St. Peter's in Malone, St. Joseph, Presentation in North Fond du Lac, St. Louis, St. Patrick's, and Sacred Heart. As Archbishop Samuel Stritch put it in 1938, when the sisters took charge of St. Patrick's, quote, "Fond du Lac belongs to the Sisters of St. Agnes," end quote. So their work did not go unnoticed. The Lutheran mayor of Fond du Lac wrote to Bishop Henny that he was astounded at the exhibition that the students put on at the end of the school year. And he said that Milwaukee residents would be lucky to have such progress in their city. In 1874, the sisters made improvements to St. Agnes School. They built a 2-story house that would serve as classrooms and a chaplain's residence. And they opened a convent school for candidates and novices to provide an education to their own members. So this school would eventually be called St. Agnes High School. The curriculum included classes on physics, the classics, civics, pedagogy, geometry, and music. All this time, Father Haas, who had been named rector and protector of CSA, had continued to work on his draft constitutions for the sisters. In 1874, Bishop Henny approved the revisions, and a year later, Pope Pius IX issued a decree of praise. They received final approval in 1880 from Pope Leo XIII. Now the sisters had access to Rome and were no longer dependent on the will of the local bishop. In 1876, with 80 professed sisters and 9 novices, Mother Agnes realized they needed a bigger mother house than the 2-story frame house they had been using. So she hired an up-and-coming architect, Wilhelm Schickel, to design a new convent with an eye toward the future. He designed a 4-story E-shaped building, although the sisters were only able to afford 1 wing at this time. Construction began in 1877, and Mother Agnes, always with an eye on the accounts, found small ways to save money. She would bake bread and make coffee for the workers so they would stay productive and happy. And when they left for the day, the sisters would go out and put bricks into accessible piles so the workers wouldn't be spending their whole day moving bricks around. They would be laying the bricks instead. So the history of Fond du Lac County, published shortly after the building had been finished, called it one of the largest and finest buildings in Fond du Lac. It housed 120 sisters and 22 orphans. Sister Claude Feldner, who resided in the mother house during her formation years in the 1910s, describes it this way. The building was imposing on the outside but simple in construction. The kitchen, refectories, vegetable cellar, and trunk rooms were in the basement. The first floor contained administration, chapel, and the assembly hall. The second floor had a balcony looking over the chapel for the infirm, and sisters' rooms and dormitories. On the third floor, there was a huge wooden water tank, which sometimes overflowed. The candidates slept in a dormitory on 4.5, an attic with wooden rafters, primitive washrooms, meaning pitchers and basins, and ever-present bats. The sisters still had corn husk mattresses. When they made their beds, they poked their hands in them and would fluff up the husks. So the candidates, novices, and sisters were still experiencing some unpleasantness. But they pushed through it because they knew that this is where God was calling them to be. In 1884, Mother Agnes had the opportunity to go to Rome and have an audience with Pope Leo XIII. She asked for blessings on each member of the community and their family members and friends. She then offered him the gift of a new skull cap. He took the one off his head, gave it to her, and then put the new one on his head. Sister Seraphine Morrissey, Mother Agnes's traveling companion, writes, "We left the Vatican filled with indescribable joy." On this trip, they also visited the Marian Shrine of Loreto, where Agnes prayed that Father Haas would give her permission to build a hospital in Fond du Lac, as residents had been begging her to do for some time. Back in the States in 1886, Mother Agnes bought another 5.5 acres of land in order to construct the chapel wing of the convent. Completed in 1887, the chapel had a 3-story vaulted ceiling with Gothic arches. An 11-foot painting of St. Agnes by Tertulliano Giacomo was commissioned for the chapel, but it ended up being too small. In 1890, Wilhelm Lamprecht painted a much bigger fresco of the martyrdom of St. Agnes. This period of growth and improvement continued through the 1890s. In 1892, the Mother House was electrified and the congregation was incorporated. By 1893, they had purchased another 10 acres, extending the property to Gillette Street. And there were 173 professed sisters, 12 novices, and 38 candidates. The sisters were responsible for the education of over 5,700 kids from New York to Kansas. They were so well regarded as teachers that in the Dakota Territory, they were asked to write a course of study for teachers based on their methods of teaching. In 1894, they purchased a house and 2 lots across the street from St. Mary's Church. And in 1901, they used those 2 lots to build a convent for the sisters teaching at the school. And that convent also included St. Cecilia's Academy of Music on the upper levels, where the sisters taught music to students for many years. But all was not going well during this time of growth. Father Haas had been ill with tuberculosis, Bright's disease, and influenza for some time. He had resided in Rome since 1887, after being named Definitor General of the Capuchin Order, but he longed to return to Wisconsin to recuperate. He was moved into the chaplain's house on the CSA grounds and died there on June 21, 1895. Father Haas had been affectionately known as Pa to the sisters, as he provided the counsel and structure the sisters needed in those early transitional years. A friend and mentor to Mother Agnes, he offered practical advice as she led the young congregation. In 1872, he gave her some advice on leadership. Quote, "Let me have the assurance that you act with firmness and determination in all things, and that you put aside every bit of human consideration as soon as duty or order demands. You must act, not feel. Always pray in important matters, then proceed bravely. I know you are being sorely tried, and that you suffer, but I cannot consider that now. You are the superior." A little bit of tough love there, but it had to have been inspiring to a 25-year-old Mother Agnes, since we now know her for her courage and risk-taking. While Mother Agnes mourned her dear friend and mentor, she moved forward on the plan to open a hospital in Fond du Lac. For 10 years, Fond du Lac leaders had been begging her to establish a hospital, but she lacked both the funding and the sisters to staff it. In 1887, St. Paul's Hospital opened under the auspices of the Episcopal Church, but it closed within a year. Dr. Frank Wiley tried to restart it a few times, but to no avail. So he visited Mother Agnes, along with local business leaders John and Henry Boyle, and Father Joseph Keenan from St. Patrick's Parish. Mother Agnes said she was willing to consider a hospital as long as she got the appropriate support from the community. In January 1895, the Fond du Lac Businessmen's Association pledged $55,000 to the project. Later that month, CSA's Board of Directresses approved construction of the hospital, resolving that, quote, "The erection of the hospital and its management by sisters would be a work of charity and humanity for the care of the sick regardless of religious denominations," end quote. Archbishop Frederick Katzer signed off on the project, and Mother Agnes got busy raising money, discussing plans with an architect, again, her favorite Wilhelm Schickel, and selecting and preparing sisters who would be the administrators and staff of the hospital. Sisters Evarista Ulrich, Amanda Hildebrand, and Charitas Schnitzler were sent to St. Joseph's Hospital in Chicago for 8 months to study nursing and surgical techniques. Dr. Wiley, for his part, took postgraduate courses in Europe to become the chief of staff. There was wide support in the community for the hospital, but some questioned if CSA was the best choice to run it. 3 men met with Mother Agnes and offered every argument they could think of why CSA shouldn't do this. Finally, Mother Agnes stood up and said, "Gentlemen, when Christ was on earth, he not only preached, he also healed the sick. Would you say that he did good work with that?" They replied yes, but then one of them snapped, "But you're not Christ." Mother Agnes replied, "No indeed, nor do we pretend to be. But Christ has called us to continue his work on earth, and as long as God permits illness, he will also expect his creatures to care for the sick. We have considered the matter and have decided to undertake the building of the hospital. We shall not reverse our decision. Good day, gentlemen, and thank you for your interest." The hospital, called St. Agnes Sanitarium until 1900, was completed and blessed by Archbishop Katzer on June 23, 1896. The building itself cost $32,000, while equipment and furnishings bumped up the total cost to nearly $48,000. The colonial-style building was situated on 10 acres of lawn scattered with oak and elm trees. The first floor contained a reception hall, parlors, a doctor's office, pharmacy, dining room, and rooms for the male patients. The second floor contained the chapel and rooms for female patients. The third floor was the surgical department. Private rooms, board, and nursing cost between $8 and $15 per week. A bed in a ward cost $5. If surgery was necessary, an additional $5 was added for dressings and other supplies. There was no electricity in the building, so small oil lamps were used to light the rooms, and sisters carried lanterns in the hallways. Cooking was done on kerosene stoves, and the elevator was operated by hand pulleys. There was one telephone in the building, and some rooms were connected with speaking tubes. Wide iron balconies not only offered, quote, opportunities for pleasant promenades, but would also greatly facilitate the escape of inmates in case of a conflagration. So good to know. Just as an aside, I'd like to point out the list of resident physicians from a promotional booklet from the hospital's opening. There was one female doctor on staff, Dr. Flora Reed. So even in 1896, the sisters made sure that they were equal opportunity employers. The hospital officially opened on July 1st, 1896, but the day before, 7-year-old Otto Schmidt was admitted with typhoid fever. Despite all the clamor from the community to build a hospital, it didn't attract a lot of patients in that first year. At the time, a lot of people still viewed hospitals as the place where people go to die rather than where they go to be healed. So that first year, the hospital saw only 82 patients and 2 births. Lanterns were placed in the windows of unused rooms, and someone would race their carriage up Division Street to make it look like the hospital was busier than it actually was. Those efforts seem to have paid off, because the following year saw 257 patients. Looking to provide milk, eggs, and vegetables for the hospital and convent, Mother Agnes purchased 293.5 acres of farmland owned by Owen Wells, east of town, in March of 1898. In the shadow of the ledge, the property included a house, barns, shed, and farm animals. In September 1899, she purchased another 117 acres from Wells. What had been called Cold Springs Farm was renamed St. Joseph Springs Farm. The sisters worked the land along with a farm manager and farm hands. And a section of the farm was set aside and turned into St. Joseph Springs Cemetery. So up until that time, sisters were usually buried wherever they had died. So Father Rarrell had come across this land in his early mission trips and excitedly described the springs and the beauty of the place. He wrote, quote, "Oh, how I wish the Agnes sisters might someday live on this beautiful land watered by the springs," end quote. It would take more than a century, but in 2002, the Sisters of St. Agnes fulfilled Father Rarrell's wish and built their current mother house on this land. So you'll remember the Boyles contributed to the establishment of St. Agnes Hospital. One of the brothers, John, decided to create a memorial to his mother, Mary, by building a sanitarium for people recovering from tuberculosis or other illnesses. His plan was to turn it over to the sisters to manage. The cornerstone for St. Mary's Springs Sanitarium was laid on June 12, 1901, adjacent to the sisters' farm, and construction on the 28-room sanitarium was completed on May 14, 1902. In the midst of the construction, St. Agnes Hospital decided they needed a hydrotherapy unit, but they didn't have room in the hospital building for it. So the sisters added a 2-story annex to the sanitarium to fulfill that need. The facility used the natural spring waters and was built entirely of stone from the ledge. Boyle gave an additional $5,000 to the hydrotherapy project. Not to be outdone, Boyle's brother Henry built the Henry Boyle Catholic Home for the Aged in 1903 and gave it to the sisters to operate, along with $39,500 in bonds and cash, with the stipulation that the property must always be used to care for the elderly. The 3-story home included 27 residential rooms, sitting rooms, a kitchen, a dining room for residents, and a private dining room for the sisters. In 1919, a fire broke out and 3 residents died from smoke inhalation. Sister Patrice Leahy was injured trying to rescue a patient, and the superior of the house, Sister Delphine Keenan, died a week later from exposure and shock. In 1930, Henry Boyle's widow Julia funded construction of St. Patrick's Chapel in the home, and another wing was added in 1959. But the needs of the aging population in Fond du Lac outgrew the Boyle home. So in 1977, the sisters built St. Francis Home near the hospital to care for the elderly. Mother Agnes had not been in good health for quite some time, and all these building projects and rapid expansion of ministries, in addition to her regular administrative duties, took their toll on her health. In the fall of 1904, she decided to go to Texas, hoping the warm climate there would help her recuperate. So she made it as far as Hays, Kansas, where she and her companions had to stop. She purchased a house from the Beach family there, where she could stay and rest, and she intended that later it could be used as a rest home for tubercular sisters. Her health improved slightly, but then it took a turn, and she died on March 6, 1905, at the age of 57, having served the congregation as superior for nearly 41 years. Her last words were, "So soon? Too soon, perhaps, but look at all she accomplished." She governed the congregation with wisdom and fearlessness. She was devoted to the educational and spiritual development of her sisters. She had that rare combination of vision and the administrative skills to realize that vision. She never wanted to be seen as one of the founders of the congregation. She insisted that that honor belonged to Father Rarrell alone. But today the sisters honor her for courage, loyalty, humility, resolve, and compassion. So where did the Sisters of St. Agnes go from here with their 3 founders gone? The new superior, Mother Antonia Schmitz, inherited 276 professed sisters who ministered at a music school, hospital, farm, sanitarium, retirement home, immigrant hospitality house, orphanage, and numerous parish schools in 7 states. The next decades became a period of expansion for the sisters. Under the leadership of Mother Antonia and her successors, Mother Marcella Kettner, Mother Joseph Wolford, and Mother Aloysia Lycum, CSA took on more schools, built 3 more hospitals, and created their own educational institutions to train sisters and lay women as teachers and nurses. I'd like to spend a little time now talking about some of the institutions the Sisters of St. Agnes established in Fond du Lac. St. Mary's Springs Sanitarium east of town had proved to be unsuccessful, so its benefactor, John Boyle, suggested that the sisters open up a boarding school in that location, and he would pay for the improvements. The 2 buildings were renamed Boyle Hall and St. Agnes Hall, and the new St. Mary's Springs Academy opened on September 9, 1909. Archbishop Sebastian Mesmer dedicated the school a month later. Room, board, and tuition cost $75 per year. The school offered classes for grades 1 through 8, as well as a 2-year commercial course and a 4-year classical curriculum. The school's brochure also touted the recreational opportunities for its students, stating, quote, "Exercise in the open air is indulged in 3 or 4 times a day. Thus, vigor of the body is developed as a foundation for the healthy mind," end quote. By 1914, the Springs had 60 students from Wisconsin, Illinois, and New York. In 1929, a new main building was constructed. It included a chapel, auditorium, and 8-story tower. The new space allowed the school to accept day students who would pay an annual tuition of $700. Traditionally, parochial schools educated boys and girls in separate institutions, but the Great Depression caused enrollments to sag, and so Archbishop Samuel Stritch gave the sisters permission to make SMSA coeducational, with the goal being to erect a boys' school once it was feasible, but that never came to fruition. The 1940s brought expansion to many facets of the school, including the introduction of both football and band, a new physics lab, and additional classes such as aeronautics. However, due to the increasingly large enrollments, the elementary grades were dropped incrementally over time, and the school became exclusively a high school. However, the school would eventually circle back to its roots and now accommodates pre-K through 12th grade students. So you'll remember that Mother Agnes purchased the beach house when she was in Hays, Kansas, where she hoped to create a rest home for sisters. Instead, in 1909, Mother Antonia opened St. Anthony's Hospital there. Now with 2 hospitals to staff, the sisters needed a training program for nurses. They established St. Agnes School of Nursing on October 3, 1910. Classes were held in the convent community room, and the faculty consisted of 3 doctors from the hospital and 2 sisters who gave instructions. The school was accredited in 1912. In 1917, the First World War caused a shortage of nurses, so St. Agnes School of Nursing instituted a 6-month accelerated program for lay women. A year later, they decided to open up the school to lay women on a regular basis. CSA purchased a large 3-story home as a residence for up to 30 lay students. And then in 1931, as enrollments grew, a 5-story brick building was constructed to house the School of Nursing. The first 2 floors held classrooms, lounges, a library, and a combination gymnasium and auditorium. The other 3 floors had accommodations for 137 students. During World War II, the School of Nursing took part in the Cadet Nurse Corps program, which offered federal funding to nursing schools that accelerated their course of study to graduate more nurses. Between 1943 and 1948, St. Agnes School of Nursing graduated 240 cadet nurses. In 1966, the school graduated as last class, as the program was integrated into Marian College's curriculum. Over the 56 years of its existence, the school produced 1,575 nurses. But remember that CSA was traditionally a teaching congregation. During the first part of the 20th century, standards and license requirements for teachers became more robust. Sister Vera Neighbor, who was in charge of the sisters' teaching training program, made arrangements with Oshkosh Normal School, now UW Oshkosh, to help sisters earn their certification. However, in January 1936, the school told Sister Vera that the sisters could not do their student teaching in public schools if they were wearing their habits. So they had to make another plan. Sister Vera suggested to Mother Aloysia that they either build a house of studies near a college or open their own college at the Mother House. The novice mistress, Sister Frederica Spuler, said she believed the only way to keep Agnesian spirit alive was to establish a college in the community, and so that's what they did. It just happened that construction on the east wing of the Mother House was nearing completion, fulfilling Wilhelm Schickel's original vision for the convent. So that was the ideal location to hold classes. CSA was not alone in opening a college. From 1920 to 1942, the number of Catholic colleges for women in the U.S. had risen from 54 to 117. On September 8, 1936, the Feast of the Nativity of Mary, Marian College opened in the CSA Mother House. The student body consisted of 21 full-time students and 25 part-time students. Sister Vera served as the first dean, and the faculty consisted of 4 sisters and 2 priests. In the first year, the curriculum included courses in German, history, algebra, apologetics, English, biology, Latin, art, psychology, and music. Classes were held in evenings and on Saturdays to accommodate sisters and rural teachers who were still working to complete their bachelor's degrees. Having a college inside a convent is not without difficulties. Novices and candidates were not allowed to socialize with lay students outside the classroom. Hallways were kept quiet so as not to interfere with the routines of the mother house. Lay students had a lounge, but it was separated from the academic dean's office by a thin partition, so there were to be no loud noises or shenanigans from those students. By 1950, there were 86 full-time and 145 part-time students, and the congregation realized they needed a new campus to accommodate the expanding enrollments. They also had to provide modern science laboratories and support more extensive library holdings. In 1960, Marion was accredited by the North Central Association of Colleges and Schools, and the congregation felt confident that the time had come to create a new college campus. George Hutter Jr., a local building contractor, donated 14 acres of land for a new residence hall, which would be called Regina Hall. That opened in 1962. In 1963, the congregation approved construction of the 28-acre campus bordered by National and Division Streets. The school was designed for 600 to 700 students, and classes began in September 1966. CSA continues to sponsor the school, now called Marion University. I'd like to go back to the hospital before we wrap up here. As use of the hospital grew, renovations and additions had to be made. A new wing was added in 1913 to give the hospital 60 beds, an X-ray lab, and pathology lab. For the sisters to staff these specialized departments, they had to receive extensive education. One example is that of Sister Jeanette Boda, who entered the convent in 1909. She spent a few years as a teacher before being told she would be trained to run the pathology lab at the hospital. She studied nursing, pathology, and bacteriology at Marquette University, UW-Madison, and in Rochester, Minnesota, home of the Mayo Clinic. She's just one example of the congregation's efforts to improve the educational standards of the sisters so they could develop professionally and spiritually in order to excel in their ministries. Between 1896 and 1923, the hospital handled 38,273 cases and 1,725 births. Patients came from 16 states and 46 Wisconsin counties. In 1919, the hospital provided free care to an average of 10% of its daily patients. In 1920, the hospital was given an A classification of accredited hospitals, and it was among the first members of the Catholic Hospital Association, now called the Catholic Health Association. With these hospital population statistics in hand, the sisters began a public fundraising campaign for $100,000 of the projected $700,000 in construction costs for a new addition. In support of this effort, Episcopalian Bishop Reginald H. Weller said, quote, "To my mind, the whole responsibility for the hospital rests upon the Sisters of St. Agnes. It is their broad vision and their timeless work and support that has made this institution possible." End quote. With the support of the Fond du Lac community, construction was completed in July 1925, and the hospital now boasted 250 beds. Sister nurses and technicians were being kept busy at the hospital. Sister Jeanette, in speaking to the Catholic Hospital Association in 1921, lamented that, quote, "One of the greatest impediments of progress in our hospitals lies in the fact that one sister is sometimes given charge of too many departments. I know a case in which one sister in a moderately large hospital is in charge of the pathological laboratory, the X-ray laboratory, the pharmacy, and the record department. The work will have to be lightened to give sufficient time for the practice of the prescribed religious exercises, for meals, sleep, for quiet study, reading, experimental work, outside diversions, and recreation." End quote. But you know what they say about idle hands. So more renovations were made to the hospital in 1954, and then in 1975, the sisters moved out of their mother house at 390 East Division Street to make way for the new hospital construction. In 2018, after over 120 years of providing healthcare to Fond du Lac, CSA transferred sponsorship of the hospital to SSM Health. By 1945, 75 years after Mother Agnes and 26 sisters arrived in Fond du Lac, the congregation operated 4 hospitals in Wisconsin and Kansas, a college, a nursing school, 2 orphanages in Michigan, a hospitality house in New York, and 50 schools in 8 states. And that year they embarked on a new chapter in their history by sending 4 missionary sisters to Waspam, Nicaragua. So in addition to celebrating 150 years in Fond du Lac this year, the sisters are also celebrating 75 years in Nicaragua. I used to be amazed that all these talented women somehow ended up at the Sisters of St. Agnes. The congregation has been blessed with gifted scholars and scientists, artists and educational innovators, and yes, even a licensed electrician. They had administrators who could not only erect hospitals and higher education institutions from practically nothing, but then manage them for decades. But I think back on something Father Haas wrote to Bishop Henny in 1871. He wrote, quote, "I cherish a firm confidence in the viability of this congregation of St. Agnes. Its spirit is unassuming but sound," end quote. Unassuming but sound. So these were regular women, or to paraphrase the title of Sister Margaret's book, Ordinary Women. But when they joined the congregation of Sisters of St. Agnes, they were given the opportunity and the freedom to use all of their gifts in a way the broader society would not have allowed. Think about how education and healthcare would have been different in this country if not for the efforts of religious sisters over the last 200 years. And today, sisters are having those same impacts in areas of social services and peace and justice, going to help wherever they see a need. I suspect a lot of you are watching this talk because you have some connection to the Sisters of St. Agnes. Maybe you were educated by them, they cared for your health needs, or they simply walked with you when you were in need. If you've been influenced by the sisters in some way, I encourage you to reach out and thank them. They never ask for accolades, but it's always nice to be remembered. Because of the pandemic, we weren't able to celebrate this anniversary the way we had planned, but I would like to tell you about a couple things we're doing. We have an exhibit on display in the library through the end of September, and then in October it's going to Marian University. If you can't get to see it in person, you can also experience virtually through our website. We also have a virtual walking tour of CSA's mission sites around Fond du Lac. Here you can read a brief historical sketch and see photographs of all the places in the community CSA has served for the last 150 years. You can access this directly at theclio.com/tour/1157 or find the link on our website. Thank you for listening, and please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.